Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most consequential what-if scenarios of World War II. What if Nazi Germany had deployed operational jet fighters not in the summer of 1944, but one full year earlier, in mid-1943? This isn't just an academic exercise. The timing of Germany's jet aircraft development came so tantalizingly close to affecting the war's outcome that historians still debate how different things might have been, with even minor changes to the timeline. Before we explore this alternate history, I want to be clear about what we're doing here. This is speculative history based on solid historical facts. We'll look at what actually happened, identify the realistic choke points that delayed German jet development, and then explore what the cascading consequences might have been if those delays hadn't occurred. We're not suggesting Germany would have won the war, but rather examining how the path to Allied victory might have looked very different and potentially far more costly. Let's set the stage by understanding what was actually happening in 1943 and why the appearance of German jets at this particular moment would have been so devastating. To understand our scenario, you need to grasp where the air war stood in mid-1943. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was just beginning to hit its stride, but it was paying a terrible price. American B-17 flying fortresses were conducting daylight precision bombing raids over Germany, losing bombers at unsustainable rates. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 saw the Americans lose 60 bombers in a single day, with another 168 damaged. That's nearly a quarter of the attacking force. The British were flying nighttime area bombing raids, which reduced their losses but also their accuracy. The entire Allied bombing strategy depended on one critical assumption: that they could achieve and maintain air superiority over occupied Europe through sheer numbers and the gradual attrition of German fighter strength. Meanwhile, Germany was indeed developing revolutionary jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 262, which would become the world's first operational jet fighter, had actually first flown with jet engines in July 1942. Think about that date for a moment. The technology existed more than 2 years before the Me 262 entered combat in meaningful numbers. So what took so long? The delays were numerous and interconnected. Hitler initially insisted the aircraft be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter, wasting crucial months. The Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines were unreliable and required constant refinement. Pilot training programs had to be developed from scratch. Production facilities needed to be built and protected from Allied bombing. Each of these obstacles pushed back the deployment timeline. In reality, the Me 262 didn't see combat until July 1944 and didn't fly in significant numbers until late 1944 and early 1945, far too late to affect the war's outcome. But what if just one of those major obstacles had been overcome or avoided? For our scenario, let's identify a realistic divergence point. Imagine that in mid-1942, Hitler's advisors more forcefully convince him that the Reich needs the Me 262 as a fighter, not a bomber. In our timeline, Hitler's bomber fixation wasn't overruled until late 1943. Moving this decision forward by 15 months creates our starting point. This single change creates a cascade. Without the bomber requirement, designers don't waste months modifying the airframe. Resources aren't diverted to bomb rack development and testing. Pilot training programs begin earlier, focused on fighter tactics rather than bombing runs. Most crucially, production planning advances by a full year. Let's be realistic about what this means. Germany wouldn't suddenly have hundreds of jets in mid-1943. Early production would still be slow, perhaps 30 to 50 aircraft per month initially. Engine reliability would still be problematic, limiting each aircraft to perhaps 10 to 12 hours of flight time before requiring engine replacement. Pilot training would still be challenging, as jet aircraft flew fundamentally differently than propeller-driven fighters. But here's the key. By June 1943, Germany could realistically have had perhaps 100 to 150 operational Me-262s, with production ramping up monthly. These aircraft would be concentrated in specialized units, protecting specific high-value targets. The pilots would be experienced veterans, carefully selected and trained in the new technology. Now let me explain why this relatively small number would have had such disproportionate effects. The Me-262 wasn't just incrementally better than Allied fighters, it was revolutionary. With a top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, it was nearly 200 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, which wouldn't even arrive in Europe until December 1943. The jets could climb faster, carried heavier armament, and most importantly, could attack and disengage at will. Allied fighters simply couldn't catch them. Picture this. It's June 1943, and American bomber formations are approaching targets in the Ruhr industrial area. The mission planners expect the usual German response: conventional fighters, heavy but manageable anti-aircraft fire, and acceptable losses. Instead, radar operators at German Fighter Command identify the incoming raid and scramble a new unit, Jagdgeschwader 400, equipped entirely with Me-262s. The first the Americans know of the new threat is when silver shapes tear through their formation at unprecedented speed. Before the bomber gunners can track them, the jets have made their pass and disappeared, climbing away faster than any pursuing escort fighter can follow. In minutes, a dozen bombers are spiraling down in flames. The jets return, make another pass, and vanish again before Allied fighters can engage. This first encounter would have been absolutely shattering to Allied morale and planning. Bomber crews would return with reports of aircraft moving at impossible speeds. Intelligence officers would scramble to understand what they'd faced. Most critically, mission planners would realize their current tactics were suddenly obsolete. Let me walk you through why this matters so much. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was already controversial and costly. In our real timeline, it took until early 1944 for the Allies to achieve air superiority over Germany, and that victory came at enormous cost. If German jets had appeared in mid-1943, they would have immediately threatened that entire timeline. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Bomber crews were already pushed to the limit by conventional German defenses. The appearance of seemingly invincible jet fighters would have been devastating. In our timeline, bomber crews faced a 1 in 4 chance of being killed or captured over the course of a 25-mission tour. Those odds were barely acceptable. Dramatically increased losses might have made the campaign unsustainable. So, how would the Allies have responded? Understanding this requires us to think about the tools and options available in mid-1943. The Allies couldn't simply snap their fingers and produce their own jets. The British Gloster Meteor wouldn't fly until March 1943 and wasn't combat-ready until mid-1944 in our timeline. American jet development was even further behind. The immediate Allied response would have been tactical adaptation. Bomber formations would fly higher, despite reduced bombing accuracy. Fighter escorts would increase dramatically, though conventional fighters couldn't effectively combat the jets. Missions would be routed to avoid areas with known jet concentrations, reducing target options. More significantly, the Allied air campaign would have shifted priorities. Destroying jet production facilities and airfields would become paramount, even at the cost of delaying other strategic objectives. This would have created a complex feedback loop. More missions targeting jets means more exposure to jet attacks, but leaving jets alone means losing bombers at unsustainable rates. Intelligence would have become absolutely critical. The Allies would have desperately needed to understand jet production rates, deployment patterns, and operational limitations. In our timeline, the Allies benefited enormously from German intelligence failures and fragmented command structures. But the shock of encountering jets might have triggered more aggressive intelligence gathering and analysis. The most important Allied response, however, would have been strategic. Allied leadership would have faced a genuine crisis. The combined bomber offensive was central to Anglo-American strategy before the Normandy invasion. If jet fighters threatened to make strategic bombing impossible, the entire timetable for winning the war in Europe would come into question. Now, we need to address the practical limitations that would have constrained German jet deployment, because these constraints are crucial to understanding our scenario realistically. Even with a year's head start, Germany would have faced severe bottlenecks. First, consider raw materials. Jet engines required specialized alloys that Germany was increasingly short of as the war progressed. Chromium, nickel, and molybdenum were all in limited supply. Germany had been cut off from many international sources of these materials, and Allied bombing of transportation networks made distribution difficult. Each WW2 engine required materials that could have built multiple conventional aircraft engines. Second, manufacturing capacity was under constant threat. Allied bombing, while often inaccurate, was growing in intensity through 1943. Dispersing jet production to safer locations would reduce efficiency. Concentrating it made facilities vulnerable. The Germans faced genuine dilemmas here, with no perfect solutions. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the engines themselves remained deeply problematic. The WW004 had a service life of only 10 to 25 hours before requiring complete replacement. Modern jet engines last thousands of hours. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental limitation that restricted how aggressively the Me-262 could be used. Each combat sortie consumed precious engine life. Pilot training presented another bottleneck. Converting experienced fighter pilots to jets required months of careful instruction. The aircraft handled completely differently than propeller fighters. Takeoff and landing were treacherous. Combat tactics had to be developed from scratch. Germany couldn't simply train hundreds of jet pilots overnight. Given these realistic constraints, we might expect German jet production to reach perhaps 200 to 300 aircraft per month by early 1944, with operational strength hovering around 500 to 700 aircraft at any given time. This would make the jets a significant but not overwhelming force. With these numbers in mind, let's explore how the air war over Europe would have evolved through late 1943 and into 1944. The key insight is that even limited numbers of jets, properly deployed, could have forced massive changes to Allied operations. German strategy would have focused on defensive use of the jets, protecting critical industrial targets and transportation hubs. The Me-262's limited endurance and engine life made it poorly suited for offensive sweeps, but ideal for short-duration interceptions. German Fighter Command would have developed a layered defense, conventional fighters engaging bomber escorts with jets held back to strike the bombers themselves. This approach would have exploited the Me-262's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Jets would take off only when bombers were confirmed inbound, climb rapidly to intercept altitude, make high-speed attack runs, and land before engine limitations became critical. Each jet could potentially make 2 or 3 combat sorties per day if needed, though this would rapidly exhaust engine life. For the Allies, the learning curve would have been steep and bloody. Early tactics would have proven ineffective. Fighter escorts couldn't catch the jets, and bomber defensive fire was useless against targets moving at such high speeds. Loss rates would have spiked dramatically, perhaps reaching 15 or even 20% on missions in jet-defended areas. Over time, the Allies would have adapted. They would have learned to identify jet bases through reconnaissance and signals intelligence. Attacks on jets during takeoff and landing, when they were most vulnerable, would have become standard. Long-range fighters would have begun standing patrols over German airfields, waiting to catch jets at their most vulnerable moments. Bomber formations would have adopted new defensive formations and flight patterns. But here's the crucial point. Adaptation takes time and costs lives. Even if the Allies eventually developed effective countermeasures, the period from mid-1943 through mid-1944 would have been dramatically more costly than in our timeline. This matters enormously for our scenario. Everything we've discussed converges on one critical event, the Normandy invasion, planned for June 1944. The presence of operational German jets a year earlier would have complicated D-Day planning in profound ways. In our actual timeline, the Allies achieved complete air superiority over the invasion beaches. German aircraft were essentially absent on D-Day itself. This allowed Allied aircraft to provide devastating support to the landing forces, interdicting German reinforcements and providing close air support. The absence of German air power was a crucial factor in the invasion's success. Now imagine the planning sessions at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in early 1944, with German jets as an established reality. Allied planners would have faced genuinely difficult questions. Could they guarantee air superiority over the beaches? Would German jets be able to attack the massive invasion fleet? Could fighter cover be maintained against an enemy that could strike and disappear at will? The likely Allied response would have been to massively increase fighter coverage over the invasion area while simultaneously conducting an intensive campaign against jet bases in France and the Low Countries. This would have required diverting resources from other objectives and potentially delaying the invasion to ensure adequate preparation. Here's where the scenario gets particularly interesting. By spring 1944, the Allies would have had their own jets beginning to enter service. The British Meteor was combat-ready by July 1944 in our timeline. Accelerated development in response to the German jet threat might have brought this forward to April or May 1944. American jets were further behind, but the P-80 Shooting Star program might have been accelerated dramatically. The actual invasion might have proceeded on a similar schedule, but with much higher anticipated casualties and reduced confidence of success. Alternatively, Allied leadership might have chosen to delay until late summer 1944, waiting for larger numbers of their own jets and more thoroughly suppressed German jet capability. Let's step back and consider the bigger strategic implications of this scenario. Earlier, German jets wouldn't have changed certain fundamental realities of the war. Germany was still fighting a multi-front war against enemies with superior resources. The Soviet Union was grinding westward, regardless of what happened in the air over Western Europe. Germany's oil shortage was growing more acute monthly. The Atlantic Wall was still vulnerable to amphibious assault. However, earlier jets might have bought Germany time, and in war, time can be critical. If the strategic bombing campaign had been severely disrupted for even 6 months, German production of conventional weapons would have been higher. If D-Day had been delayed by several months, the Western Allies and Soviets would have met further east, dramatically changing the post-war map of Europe. Most significantly, if the war in Europe had dragged into late 1945 or even 1946, the first atomic bomb would have become a European weapon rather than a Pacific one. This is perhaps the darkest possibility emerging from our scenario. Allied leadership, frustrated by prolonged German resistance and mounting casualties, might have chosen to use nuclear weapons against German cities rather than suffer through additional months or years of conventional warfare. The human cost bears consideration as well. In our timeline, the last year of the war in Europe was extraordinarily bloody. Prolonging the conflict would have meant hundreds of thousands of additional casualties on all sides, continued Holocaust operations for longer, and extended suffering for millions of occupied Europeans. So, what's the takeaway from this exploration? I think there are several important insights that emerge from this speculative exercise. First, timing in warfare is absolutely critical. The Me-262 arrived too late to matter because of a series of decisions and circumstances, any one of which might have been different. The war was won and lost on margins that seem obvious in retrospect, but were anything but clear at the time. Second, technological advantages are real, but not decisive on their own. Even with a year's head start, German jets would have faced insurmountable constraints of production, logistics, and pilot training. The Allies would have adapted, developed countermeasures, and ultimately prevailed, though at higher cost. Third, the path to historical outcomes often appears more inevitable than it actually was. We think of World War II's outcome as predetermined by Allied industrial and manpower superiority, but the actual campaigns were contingent on countless decisions and circumstances. Different choices at key moments could have changed timelines, casualties, and post-war arrangements without necessarily changing the ultimate outcome. The scenario we've explored today represents a realistic alternative history, grounded in the actual technology and constraints of the period. It's a reminder that history is shaped by human decisions, technological developments, and pure chance, all interacting in complex ways. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into alternate history, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment letting me know what other World War II scenarios you'd like me to explore. Until next time, keep questioning how things might have been different.